And my theme today, Madam Speaker, is going to be that this is all coming back to the problem that the Liberals do not have any regard for the rule of law in this country. Canada is built on the rule of law. It's what makes us a civilized society. But we have seen from the time these Liberals were elected in 2015 that there has been a lack of respect for the law and a continual erosion of the rule of law in Canada. And so, Madam Speaker, let me spend a few minutes talking about that. From 2015, when they were elected and they first brought forward Bill C-83 that would force judges, when considering bail, to put the least restrictive measures on an individual, to reduce it to the easiest. And that was the beginning of what has become catch and release in this country. In 2017, the Prime Minister did $215,000 of taxpayer on the fraud when he went to Billionaire Island. The RCMP ended up not investigating it, but you know, at the end of the day, that sets the expectation of what kind of respect for the rule of law should we have. And if the Prime Minister doesn't have any, then you can see that it's going to go through the whole lot. In 2019, C-75 was brought forward by this government. And in that, they removed a lot of the mandatory minimums and set sentencing to be either a fine or a summary conviction of up to 2 years. Again, diluting the rule of law in this country. And many of the things on the list were egregious. I mean, kidnapping, some terrorism offenses. There's a whole list of things that they reduced to a fine or a slap on the wrist, a summary conviction of less than 2 years, Madam Speaker. And then we see that in 2022, they brought in C-5. Again, this is something that has led to further erosion of the rule of law. And I want to read a couple of things, just so you can see the impact of all of this. Many of the comments were made by my friend, the member from Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, who himself was a very experienced prosecutor when he came to this place. And, you know, he said when it comes to the different rules that were introduced, there were some that basically did not help. He said when Justice Minister David Lametti introduced Bill C-5 in November of 2022, he described it as giving those who made small mistakes a second chance at life. The bill was really about eliminating mandatory minimum sentences for second and third convictions of serious gun and drug crimes, Madam Speaker. And so the introduction of all of these laws to chip away at the rule of law, to allow criminals to go back on the streets, has an impact, Madam Speaker. And I want to talk about what that impact is. So from the time these Liberals took power in 2015, homicide is up 33%. Auto theft is up 39%. Theft over $5,000, up 49%. Identity theft, up 121%. Child sexual abuse, up 141%. Human trafficking, up 210%. Extortion, up 429%. Child pornography, up 565%, and sexual assault up 75%. Madam Speaker, there is an impact when you remove the rule of law and the consequences that are put in place to disincentivize criminals from repeat offending. Many order paper questions have been done to find out, you know, what is happening with the catch and release, giving the least restrictive bail. And so you know, they've said that 1/3 of homicides that are committed today in Canada are committed by somebody that's out on bail for a previous violent offense. I want to read some of the human cost to that. There was a shootout in Toronto, and of the 23 suspects collared, the sources say they found that 1 was wanted for an unsolved murder and 4 were free on bail conditions. Here's another one. A gentleman was facing an attempted murder and gun charge, allowed out on an ankle monitor, which he cut off. They say the man was ordered to wear a GPS ankle monitor after being let out on bail in September 2023 while his case was before the courts, and he cut it off and fled. And he's currently before the courts, Madam Speaker, for this: 2 counts of attempt to commit murder using a restricted firearm, careless use of a firearm, possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose, unauthorized possession of a firearm, unauthorized possession of a weapon, knowledge of unauthorized possession of a firearm, possession prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, use of a firearm while committing an offense, 2 counts of possession of Schedule I substance for the purpose of trafficking. Who thought it was a good idea, Madam Speaker, to let a guy like this out on an ankle bracelet? Similarly, there's a man that, he's a 36-year-old Montreal man, let out on bail after allegedly uttering death threats against his partner. He's now accused of murdering her on the South Shore. Here's another one from CTV News. Authorities have issued a public warning after a 19-year-old facing multiple criminal charges, including 2 counts of sexual assault, was released on bail in Vancouver. In a news release, the Vancouver Police Department said that Bryce Michael Flores Bebbington poses a risk of significant harm to public safety in relation to alleged unprovoked physical and sexual violence against strangers. Again, who thought it was a good idea to let this guy, that's a danger to the public, that they had to issue a warning to the public? Who thought it was a good idea to let this person out on bail, Madam Speaker? It's not a good idea, but it's this Prime Minister and this Liberal government that has continued to allow criminals off to reoffend. Let's look at some of the most heinous examples, starting with Paul Bernardo. Madam Speaker, I'm from St. Catharines. I was born there. I went to school with Kristen French's brother, Brian. I lived a block and a half from where they lived, and I walked the same street where Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey were taken every single day of the 5 years I was in high school, Madam Speaker. And so I followed this case, and it was disgusting what was done to these girls and the many other victims. And, Madam Speaker, he deserved to be in maximum security prison, but under these Liberals, they put him in a minimum security where there's hockey and tennis, and I'm sure he's having a much better time there. And now, when he comes up for his parole hearing, they won't even allow the victim's family to attend, Madam Speaker. That is what this Liberal government has done to the rule of law in Canada. Let me give you another example. Let's talk about Terry Lynn McClintock and Michael Rafferty. These 2 sickos who took an 8-year-old Tori Stafford, and they sexually assaulted her and murdered her, Madam Speaker. They're child killers, Madam Speaker. And yes, they were in maximum security until eventually Terry Lynn McClintock was let out into a healing lodge, minimum security. A healing lodge, Madam Speaker. And it wasn't until the Conservatives found out and made a big stink about it that they put her back to a more secure prison. But as soon as our back was turned, where did she go? Oh, now she's in a townhouse in a minimum security facility next door to a Mothers with Children program. You heard it right, Madam Speaker. Terry Lynn McClintock has access to children while in prison when she's a child killer. Madam Speaker, this is the undermining of the rule of law that this Liberal government has done. It's totally unacceptable. And we see the results on our streets. For over a year, we've had these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas illegal protests, blocking roads, calling death to Jews, death to Canada, burning our flag, Madam Speaker. And all the while, what is being done from an enforcement point of view? Nothing. Very few arrests. This incident in Montreal, thousands of people rioting, and 3 arrests, Madam Speaker. And they'll probably be out on bail before you know it. And so, it's an undermining of the rule of law. It's also an undermining of letting people into the country that are criminals and terrorists, Madam Speaker. It's been admitted by the immigration minister that there was a period of time where, because of the backlog, They took off doing security checks on people that were coming into the country. And Madam Speaker, we've seen how that goes. They also decided to let 3,000 Gazans in when none of the other countries around would take them because of concerns about their links to Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization. But Canada brought them in. And we've seen ISIS terrorists that were brought in through our immigration program. So this lack of respect for the rule of law extends to other departments that is inviting chaos into the country. Because when people come in and they want to become Canadian citizens, there's two things that they have to promise to do. Actually, no, there's three. But the first two is to obey the rule of law in Canada. That's one of the things you have to do. It's one of the things that is part of any visa that you come to the country on. Tourist visa, work permit, you name it, you're agreeing to obey the law of Canada. So every one of these illegal protesters, they should actually be charged if they're Canadian citizens. Their files should be flagged if they're permanent residents so they can't become Canadian citizens because they are not upholding the rule of law in Canada. They are part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I'm sure our neighbors across the aisle here will get up and decide that I'm a racist. I'm not a racist, but I'm about the rule of law applying equally to all, Madam Speaker. If I get up and I block a road, I know they're going to arrest me in a New York minute. If I do a crime, I'm going to get arrested, Madam Speaker. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening. In Toronto, there was a protest. They were calling death to Jews. One of the Jewish women, they were harassing them in their own neighborhood, Madam Speaker. One of the Jewish women went to the police and said, arrest these people. And the police said, there's nothing we can do. Well, Madam Speaker, what is the point of having laws if you don't enforce them? What is the point? And the federal government puts the rule of law in place. And the federal government has a responsibility. If the rule of law is not being enforced by the police, they have the RCMP that they can escalate it to. They have the military that can be brought in. We know in the peaceful protest of the Freedom Convoy that they decided to declare the Emergency Measures Act, which was deemed illegal because it didn't meet the threshold, Madam Speaker. And what's the threshold? Has to be violence taking place across the country. Check the box. Has to be proof that there's foreign interference. Well, there's been a lot of proof about the Iranians that are backing up the pro-Palestinian protests, so check the box there. And it has to be beyond the resources of the police and the existing laws. So, Madam Speaker, I would argue maybe it's time to revisit that whole one. But, of course, right now, even though it was declared illegal, not a single one of the individuals that voted for it is having any consequence at all while they appeal the process. Where I, if I committed a crime, could appeal from prison, Madam Speaker. So, again, not acceptable. The good news is that it wasn't like this before the Prime Minister arrived with the Liberals that are corrupt. And it won't be like that when we get rid of them, Madam Speaker, okay? We will come, common sense Conservatives, with a plan to stop the crime, to stop the gun crime by upping the security at our borders, to keep the smuggling of illegal guns that the police associations are saying is 85% of the gun crime. We will bring car theft down by doing more scanning at the ports, Madam Speaker. We have plans that will get the hard drugs off of our streets, Madam Speaker, and be jail, not bail for repeat violent offenders, Madam Speaker. That's what we need in this country. We have good laws, but we have to start enforcing them. And we can't keep reinforcing to criminals that they can commit a crime without any consequences at all, which is essentially what happens when you commit a crime and you're out again in the afternoon to commit a crime again. We've all heard the statistics about the 6,000 crimes that were committed in Vancouver in 1 year by 40 individuals. Madam Speaker, I would argue that to put those 40 individuals off the streets, away from where they're damaging the public, is the wiser way. It's a common sense way. It's something that we will do.